Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I cover mostly Australian true crime, and today I am covering the Australian true crime case. It's known as the backpacker killer or the backpacker killings in the media, or sometimes the Belanglo Forest killings. The movie Wolf Creek was based off of this crime, and this is one of the biggest homicide investigations Australia has ever seen. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So on the 19th of December 1992, two runners were orienteering, which is like a group sport with a map, through the Belanglo State Forest. So the Belanglo State Forest is located south of the town of Berrima in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales in Australia, and Belanglo is roughly 3,800 hectares and is about 3 kilometres off the Hume Highway, which is one of Australia's major highways. The two runners spotted something during their run, and upon investigating were shocked to discover a decomposing corpse laying on the forest floor. And this body was actually found in an area of Belanglo called Executioner's Drop. And of course, the runners immediately notified the police. So the next day, the investigators were at the crime scene when they made another horrifying discovery. And that was another body, which was roughly 30 meters or 98 feet from where the first one was found. The two unidentified bodies in the Belanglo State Forest made national headlines, and there was a lot of speculation as to who these two unidentified people may be, because there were a few missing people in that area around that time. The bodies were eventually confirmed to be that of British backpackers Caroline Clark, who was 21, and Joanne Walters, who was 22. Joanne Walters was actually a trained nanny and had spent a few months in Sydney working and looking after children when she met Caroline Clark in a backpackers hostel. The two decided to stick together and became friends, of course, and find jobs as fruit pickers so they could prolong their stay within Australia. However, when both girls left Sydney for Melbourne in April of 1992, they were never seen or heard from again. A month after Joanne Walters' parents had not heard a word from their daughter, they flew from the UK to Australia to look for her. And her parents said it was incredibly out of character for Joanne not to contact them. After the 2-week mark of not hearing from her is when they became incredibly worried, because they knew that Joanne would find a way to contact them, knowing how worried they would be. It had been 5 months since the girls had disappeared when their remains were found. Joanne Walters, who was the first to be found, had been stabbed 14 times. 4 times in the chest, once in the neck, and 9 times in her back. And the stab wounds in her spine would have been enough to paralyze her and leave her helpless. It was also noted that the zip of her jeans were undone, but her button was done up, as if someone had put her pants back on and hastily done the button up without doing the zip up. But unfortunately, the remains were too decomposed to confirm if an indecent assault had occurred. Caroline Clark, on the other hand, had died very differently. She had been shot 10 times in the head with gunshot wounds on either side of her head, and police believed that she had been used as target practice. She also had the same paralyzing stab wounds in the spine. Also found near the bodies was a makeshift campsite and fireplace, as well as cigarette butts and .22 caliber cartridge casings. Using the bullets found in Caroline Clark's skull, as well as bullets found on the ground and the cartridge casings, police were able to identify what weapon had been used, and that was a Ruger .22 caliber rifle. However, this fact was of little help, as there was 55,000 Ruger rifles in Australia at the time. Looking into the deaths of both Joanne and Caroline told detectives that they were not only dealing with someone that had some sort of skills in shooting or potentially hunting, but they were dealing with someone that had the knowledge or the foresight to know to stab their victim in the back and paralyze them. Joanne's parents now knew where their daughter was, but now they wanted justice for Joanne and Caroline, and they wanted to find the girl's killer or killers. They made a public appeal for information in front of the media, and Joanne's parents actually bravely went to the site in Belanglo Forest where their daughter's life had been taken away from them. Over the week following the discovery of Joanne and Caroline's remains, police conducted a thorough search of Belanglo State Forest, but came up with no further evidence. And police concluded that they would probably not find any further evidence, nor did they believe they had a serial killer on their hands. Although the media at the time did speculate there may be a serial killer on the loose. And even with the amount of evidence that was found at the crime scene, nothing really eventuated from this, and the case went cold, at least for a little while. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rod Milton put together a profile of the killer to assist in the case, and this is quite common, putting together a killer's profile. So he came to the conclusion that the killer was likely male in his 30s, had a history of aggression and a history of hunting with guns. He believed the killer was most likely familiar with the terrain or surrounding terrain of Belanglo, because Belanglo Forest is big for a start and it's not easy to navigate. So it was likely he was quite aware of his surroundings. He also believed the killer was motivated by the pleasure of inflicting pain on others. And he actually thought the location of the killings, the Belanglo Forest, said a lot about the killer. He thought it said the killer was a macho type of guy and someone that frequented rough scrubs or terrains. Milton believed the killer took his victims to Belanglo to assert power and control in the situation, putting his victims in an isolated area where they felt helpless, but he felt powerful. Milton concluded the same as police that they did not have a serial killer on their hands, but he also believed that the crimes were not committed by one person. He believed that due to the nature of how different both of the girls died, had to have meant there were two killers involved. So he believed one of the killers liked personal violence, so the stabbings, and one of the killers liked violence at a distance, so the shootings. However, at the time, little did detectives know that Joanne Walters and Carolyn Clark were not the first victims of the Belanglo killer. The following year, in October of 1993, a local man, Bruce Pryor, was in a remote area of the Belanglo Forest collecting firewood, and this wasn't uncommon for him to be there because, as I said, he was local and he was very familiar with the terrain. Pryor was well aware of the discovery of remains in the forest a year earlier and in fact had really kept up with the case quite obsessively, and Pryor himself admitted to being obsessed with the case to the point that he actually pretty much conducted his own investigation. He said that he went to Belanglo Forest once a week for 9 months searching for evidence. His 9-month search paid off when he found a human skull lying on the ground of the forest, pretty much in plain sight. And Bruce Pryor describes the moment he found the skull as also the moment that he realized the killer could come back to the scene of the crime at any given time, and he pretty much wrapped up the skull in his jumper and hightailed it the heck out of Belanglo. Unbeknownst to Pryor, just 22 meters or 72 feet away from his discovery were more human remains. Pryor alerted police and led them back to where he made the gruesome discovery. However, much to Bruce Pryor's shock and dismay, he himself became a suspect of the Belanglo killings. And Pryor had really believed that detectives would be grateful for his assistance in the case. but instead he was treated like a criminal. Pryor said he found this reaction from detectives really difficult to deal with, but eventually Pryor was ruled out as the Belanglo killer. When news broke of more bodies being found in the Belanglo Forest, police officers and journalists flocked to the scene of the crime. At this point, a task force was developed for the Belanglo State Forest killings, led by Superintendent Clive Small. And I'll be talking about Clive Small quite a lot throughout this video, so just keep the name Clive Small in your mind, and remember, he is the one in charge of this investigation. A large-scale and in-depth search of the Belanglo Forest commenced at this time, and this was actually the biggest search team Australia had ever seen, made up of 300 police officers. However, Belanglo Forest was about 40 square kilometres in miles, 24 square miles. So with only 300 men on the ground, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But as the 4 bodies had been found just off dirt tracks in the Belanglo Forest, this is pretty much where investigators concentrated their efforts. The 3rd and 4th bodies were eventually identified as Deborah Everest and James Gibson, who were an Australian couple that had been travelling together. They disappeared in late December of 1989, and by this point it was October of 1993. James and Deborah, who both grew up in Melbourne, Australia, have been on holidays together in Sydney, Australia over the Christmas break of 1989. They had told friends that they were planning to hitchhike together further down south to a festival along the Hume Highway, and James's mother had actually been really worried about her son hitchhiking, and understandably so. But James assured his mum that the fact that him and Deb were hitchhiking together meant that it was safe. But the pair were never heard from again. By this point, all that was left of the couple were their skeletal remains. James had been stabbed 8 times, and as with previous victims, James had his spine severed, leaving him paralysed and helpless. Stab wounds to his back and chest would have punctured his heart and his lungs. His zipper on his pants was also down with the top button done up, as with Joanne Walters, but also with this case, the body was again too decomposed to confirm if indecent assault had occurred. And it was interesting that it seemed now that it was a male victim, maybe telling police that the perpetrator didn't have a preference, male or female, they didn't mind, or that there was 2 killers, a male and a female. Regardless, it was clear to police they were dealing with the same killer. Deborah Everest, on the other hand, had been brutally beaten by the killer. Her skull was fractured in 2 places, her jawbone was broken, and she had knife marks on her forehead. She was also stabbed once in the back, and her own tights were used to tie her up. The bodies of James and Deborah had been only 600 metres from Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. And just as with Joanne and Caroline's case, a makeshift campsite had been found near the bodies. And another interesting fact here was that James's camera and backpack were actually discovered before the couple's remains were found, before James's and Deborah's, that is. They were found by the side of the road in a suburb of northern Sydney, some 120 kilometres or 75 miles from the Belanglo Forest. Around this time, a man named Alex Milat phoned police with information that he believed may be helpful in the Belanglo killings case. He said him and a friend had been in the Belanglo Forest when they had seen another car in the Belanglo Forest with 2 women in the back that appeared to be tied up. And Alex Milat and his friend believed that these women were being abducted. And if this story sounds a little bit strange to you, well, it did to police as well. Because if you had seen, or suspected even, that 2 women had been abducted, especially in Belanglo Forest at this time. Like, nobody would not have known about the Belanglo killings. It was a national and international news story. Why would you not report it to police at the time? So this pretty much led police to investigating not only Alex Milat, but the whole Milat family. And they discovered that Alex came from a family of 14 children. He was the eldest of 10 brothers. I'm gonna actually come back to the Milat family later in this video. A month after James and Deborah were found, on November the 1st, 1993, a police officer in a clearing of Belanglo Forest discovered more human remains. The remains had been covered in branches, and all you could really visually see was a boot poking out. And all that was left were the skeletal remains of this individual. The remains were identified as 21-year-old German backpacker Simone Schmidl. She was last seen hitchhiking from Sydney in January of 1991 in an effort to find work. And at this point, Simone had been missing for 3 years. Simone was described as being very outgoing and sporty and had only been in Australia 4 months when she disappeared. She'd hitchhiked in Australia previously and believed it was safe, but unlike the other victims, Simone was traveling and hitchhiking alone when she was abducted. Simone's skeleton showed she had 8 stab wounds, 2 that severed her spinal cord, leaving her paralyzed as with previous victims. Other wounds punctured the heart and lungs. And investigators did believe that there may have been more stab wounds. Near Simone's body was also the makeshift campsite. 2 days later, on November the 3rd, 1993, the remains of a German backpacker, Anja Habschied, and I'm so sorry for my mispronunciation, I'll just be calling her Anja for the rest of the video. Her remains were found in the Belanglo Forest along with her boyfriend, Gabor Nugabar. Again, I'm going to be calling him Gabor. They had been missing since Christmas of 1991. Anja had just recently finished her studies when she decided she wanted to travel. She was 20 at the time and Gabor was 21, and they decided to travel off together to Indonesia. They left Germany in October of 1991, and Australia hadn't actually been on their planned travel list, but they made a spur of the moment decision to head over here, or to Australia, and they spent the Christmas period in Sydney and were due home in late January of 1992. The couple were found buried in shallow graves 50 metres or 160 feet apart. Anja had been stabbed 8 times and decapitated with a single blow. And despite extensive searches, her head was never found. And the decapitation really was a new level of violence for the Belanglo killer. Gabor had been shot 6 times in the head, and as with Carolyn Clark, it was believed he was used as target practice. And Gabor also had the pants with the button done up but the zipper down. Again, in this situation, it's unknown whether indecent assault occurred. It is widely believed by investigators at this point that there are certainly 2 killers committing these crimes. They also do believe that the same person or persons is responsible for all 7 of the killings. And they wanted to prove this for certain by comparing the bullets used to kill Gabor to the bullets used to kill Carolyn Clark, the British backpacker. But unfortunately, due to the course of time and decay, the unique markings that a gun produces on bullets had been destroyed in Gabor's case. All they could really gather was that a .22 caliber rifle had been used to kill Gabor. However, cartridge casings, when they are ejected from a gun, leave a similar unique marking on the case, which can then be tracked back to the gun that they came from. And there was 47 cartridge casings near Gabor's body. These cartridge casings were microscopically compared to the ones found near Carolyn Clark's body. And as I said earlier, this was a Ruger 22 caliber rifle, but there was, as I said, 55,000 of these types of guns in Australia. So unless they actually found the gun responsible for the killings and could match it up, this information was pretty much useless. At this point, the lead investigator, Clive Small, did admit to the media that Australia had a serial killer on its hands. 7 victims in total had been found in the Belanglo Forest, and the perpetrator had earned a nickname, and that was the Backpacker Killer. And as you can imagine, the Backpacker killings, which made international headlines, had a pretty negative effect on the tourism trade and the economy within New South Wales, and it had people really questioning whether it was safe to still travel to New South Wales, Australia. This factor put even more pressure on investigators to get this case solved. But also, investigators were going through the ginormous task of sifting through 1.5 million pieces of information relating to the Backpacker killings case. At this stage as well, the profile of the killer was continuously being developed. They believed him to be cold and callous, which I think is quite obvious in a killer. They also believed he came from a large family and potentially family members that had criminal records. They believed that the family probably also enjoyed hunting or shooting together, and that the perpetrator himself or herself really enjoyed or was obsessed with being in control, not only of themselves or their own life, but other people in their life. And of course, the killer would almost certainly have a strong interest in firearms. In November of 1993, police finally received a lucky break. As I said, this case made international headlines due to the fact that there was victims from the UK and from Germany. So police set up an international hotline number so anyone that had information in other countries from people that have visited Australia could ring up and let them know. Basically, they're theorizing there was basically someone may have met like a suspicious character or a bit of a dodgy character, or possibly even someone that had escaped from the Backpacker Killer. And that's exactly the call they received. British citizen Paul Onions, who was 26 at the time, had been backpacking around Australia in January of 1990, which at this point was 4 years previous. Just outside of Sydney, Paul Onions accepted a ride from a man who identified himself only as Bill, and Onion's plan had been to hitchhike from Sydney to Melbourne along the Hume Highway. He described Bill as being in his early 40s, a fit-looking man around 5'10", with a Merv Hughes style moustache. And I have no idea if anyone outside of Australia knows Merv Hughes, but I'll put a photo here of him so you know what I'm talking about. He also said that Bill had black hair and drove a white Toyota Land Cruiser 4-wheel drive with woolly seat covers. Bill initially seemed like a pretty friendly guy, but Onions became quite uneasy when Bill started asking him like a lot of questions about his plans in Australia, basically grilling him on his plans. At some point, the pair lost radio reception in the 4-wheel drive, and Bill pulled over saying he was going to get some cassette tapes from the back to play so they weren't driving along in silence. And Onions at this point decided to get out, telling Bill he was going to get some fresh air. But when Paul Onions went to get out the car, Bill basically was like, "What are you doing?" and pointed a gun at him and told Onions to put his seatbelt back on. And of course, at this point, Paul Onions figured he was in quite a bit of trouble. And despite the threat of a gun pretty much in his face, Onions very bravely decided to make a run for it. He pretty much ran into traffic as he was being shot at. and thank God someone stopped for him. Joanne Berry pulled over her car for a very frantic man who claimed he was being shot at. Berry drove Paul Onions to the police station where he made a statement about the incident, and at this time it was reported as an attempted robbery. Paul Onions' belongings were actually still in the perpetrator's vehicle, including his passport. So Onions returned to Sydney, had his passport replaced, and made a swift return back to the UK. And Paul Onions' attack actually happened to occur right near where Joanne and Caroline's remains were found, and 400 metres or 1,300 feet from the entrance of the Belanglo Forest. It seemed pretty likely that Onions was intended to be the backpacker killer's next victim, had his instinct to run for his life, literally run for his life, not kicked in. So just days before Paul Onions had rang the Backpacker Killer International hotline, Joanne Berry, the woman who'd let Paul Onions into her car and pretty much rescued him at that point, made an independent call to the hotline outlining her experience and believing that it may be connected to the Backpacker Killer investigation because it was right near Belanglo Forest. Berry said the man's name was Paul Onions and he was British, and that he'd been hitchhiking at the time of the attack. And of course, Joanne Berry's story really backed up what Paul Onions had said. Unfortunately, with the massive volume of calls the hotline received, which was 5,000 calls in the first 24 hours alone, Paul Onions and Joanne Berry's statements get lost amongst the thousands of statements that were coming in. And it's actually 5 months before his statement is looked at more closely. Head Detective Clive Small immediately requests to see the original case file in the Paul Onions incident that had occurred back in 1990, but it appeared to be missing. Fortunately for detectives, Constable Janet Nicholson had written the full report in her notebook on the incident, including even more details than the original statement. Police flew Paul Onions out to Australia to assist in their investigation. On the 5th of May 1994, Onions was asked to identify his attacker out of 13 photos on a video, and Onions identifies person number 4, Ivan Milat. This was not the first time that police had heard the family name Milat. You may remember me earlier in the video talking about Alex Milat and his statement to police about witnessing 2 women being abducted at the Belanglo Forest. And in fact, police had quite a few tip-offs about the Milat family, but nothing really solid had been put forward pretty much until this point and Paul Onions. Onions' call was really the break police had needed, and although his experience didn't prove that Ivan Milat had anything to do with the backpacker killings, it made him a pretty good suspect. And if you'll remember, some of the information that was mentioned on the backpacker killer's profile, well, a lot of that applied to Ivan Milat. He loved being in control, he was obsessed with guns, and he came from a large family. Again, this didn't prove anything at the time. So Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on December the 27th, 1944 in Guildford, New South Wales, which was on the outskirts of Sydney, and was about 100 k's or 62 odd miles from the Belanglo Forest. He was the son of I'm sorry again, my pronunciations are terrible, Marco Stephen Milat, his father, and a Croatian immigrant, and his Australian-born mother, Margaret Elizabeth Milat. He was the 5th born of 14 children, and the Milats were known as a pretty tight-knit family. The Milats grew up in a small 3-bedroom weatherboard house on some pretty rough terrain. His parents were really hard-working, and his father in particular was very strict. And although the parents really tried to raise their kids as best as they could, trying to keep up with 14 children was an effort, was difficult as you can imagine, and the Milats did not have the best reputation in town. The Milat family home had encountered more than a few police visits in its time, and the males of the Milat family had been in and out of jail and detention centre for most of their teen to adult lives. As I said, they were a tight-knit family, and the brothers often took the fall for each other when it came to crimes they committed. So for example, if they committed a robbery together, a couple of them, but only one got caught, that one would not snitch on the others. So they were quite a loyal family. Ivan Milat had been in trouble with the law from roughly the age of 17. He committed things like break-and-enters, car thefts, and armed hold-ups, but nothing as serious as killing someone else. However, by the 1990s, it appeared that Ivan Milat had really cleaned up his act, kept out of trouble with the law, and lived in a really nice suburban neighborhood. He was employed as a road worker, which was a steady job he'd had for about 16 years, and was described as a very friendly and helpful neighbor who was always tending to his garden and cleaning his car. One neighbor even described him as, quote, "If you needed something, you could go next door and get a cup of sugar." He was someone who, if the children were playing in the street and there was a car coming, he would call out. However, those that really knew Ivan Milat personally knew he was not the most pleasant person. In his private life, he was a real control freak and had even slept with some of his brother's wives. As detectives delved deeper into Ivan Milat's past, they uncovered a crime he committed in the 1970s that shot him straight to suspect number one in the backpacker killings. In 1971, Milat was charged with the abduction of two 18-year-old female hitchhikers, Margaret and Greta, and the indecent assault of one of them. It would be several years before he was charged with this crime, however, because he fled to New Zealand. In 1974, he returned to Australia and was arrested and charged with his outstanding charges. He was also charged with a robbery charge, a charge which he did beat. In court, he was represented by lawyer John Marsden. The women he had abducted stated that Milat said to them he wanted to make love to both of them. And when they rejected him, he threatened both of them with a knife. He said to them, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to kill both of you. You won't scream when I cut your throats, will you? Either one of you makes love to me or I'll kill both of you." Margaret complied to his demands while Greta was forced to watch out for oncoming cars. Ivan Milat claimed in court, however, that the whole incident had been consensual. The prosecution failed to make a convincing case, and Ivan Milat was acquitted of all charges. Detectives also discovered that Ivan and his brother Richard Milat had worked along the Hume Highway. And you may remember me saying that the Hume Highway was about 3 kilometres from the Belanglo Forest. Even more damning was the fact that Ivan owned property right near Belanglo, and the fact he'd sold his 4-wheel drive just weeks after, the first 2 victims were discovered. Going back to Paul Onions, Ivan's brother Richard had a solid alibi for the day Paul Onions was attacked, and that was he was at work. However, Ivan had no alibi, and in fact, Ivan Milat had no alibi for any day that any of the killings happened, and he was the only Milat with no alibi. Investigators went back to Alex Milat and spoke to him and his wife about the statement he'd previously given. Just when the investigators had pretty much finished speaking to Alex Milat and his wife, they both said to the investigators, "Oh, by the way, Ivan gave us this backpack." The backpack belonged to a German backpacker, Simone Schmidl. Alex Milat nor his wife really gave any reason as to why they gave detectives the backpack that day, nor is it known if they even knew the significance of that backpack. Along with all this evidence and the fact Paul Onions had positively identified Ivan Milat, gave police enough to seek a search warrant of Ivan Milat's home and various family members. Initially, investigators only had planned to arrest Ivan for the attack on Paul Onions so they could hold him in custody while they continued investigating and pretty much just get him off the streets. In the early hours of May the 22nd, 1994, 50 police officers, including some very heavily armed police officers from the Tactical Operations Unit, surrounded Ivan Milat's home. He shared this home with his sister, Shirley Swar, on Cinnabar Street in Eagle Vale, which was a suburb of Sydney. The planning of this raid took detectives weeks because they really couldn't afford to mess it up. There was also fears of a shootout, and the fact that Milat lived in a suburban neighbourhood with families and children. The results, if things went wrong, could be catastrophic, so a lot of planning was involved. A detective rang Ivan's home at 6:36 a.m. asking for Ivan. Ivan Milat answered and said that Ivan Milat wasn't home. But the detective on the phone did recognise Ivan's voice and the fact that they'd actually had surveillance on the house. So not only did they know for certain that Ivan Milat was home in the house, but they knew his girlfriend was home as well. His girlfriend's name was Chalinda Hughes. The phone rang 2 more times and Ivan eventually picked up. Ivan didn't say much, but he did agree to follow the detective's instructions once he had put some pants on. The same detective rang again after a few minutes when Milat had not emerged from his home and his girlfriend picked up, and she'd had no idea what was going on. Chalinda put Ivan back on the phone where the detective basically repeated his instructions, and Ivan pretty much just kept laughing and ignoring them. He said he couldn't see any police officers standing outside his house, and furthermore, Ivan had thought that this call had been a practical joke from a mate at work, but the detective on the line assured Milat that this was no joke. The detective suggested that Ivan leave his house first, followed by his girlfriend Chalinda, but Ivan replied, "I think we'll just walk out together." At 6:48 a.m, the detective rang Milat's home one more time when they hadn't emerged, and Chalinda answered saying that they were about to come out, and that's when they emerged from Ivan Milat's home. Ivan Milat was told to get down on the ground where he was handcuffed. It turned out that Milat had known, or at least suspected, that he was a suspect in the backpacker killings before the raid even happened. At the same time as Ivan Milat's home was being raided, his family members' homes were being raided as well. 11 houses in total and 300 police officers were involved. Police officers did not have to dig far to find what they were after in Ivan Milat's home. His home was basically a gold mine, or an Aladdin's cave, if you will, of evidence. Police were pretty much gobsmacked at the amount of evidence they actually found. I mean, they were delighted, but they were gobsmacked. A large amount of ammo and weapons were found, and potentially the most important find of all, hidden in a cavity in a wall, in a plastic bag, was various parts of a Ruger 22 caliber rifle, which you may remember was the same gun used in the backpacker killings. Upon testing, Milat's Ruger rifle was found to ballistically match the rifle that had been used in the backpacker killings. Blood-stained bindings and hunting knives were also recovered, as well as clothing, cameras, camping equipment and wallets that belonged to several of the victims. And it's believed that Ivan Milat even wore some of the victims' clothing. And even more creepy, he gave his girlfriend Chalinda one of the items of the victim's clothing. He gave Chalinda Carolyn Clark's Benetton top to wear, which is just weird. At Ivan's parents' home, in a locked cupboard, they found a long, curved cavalry sword, which was thought to be used to decapitate the German backpacker Anja. Milat was arrested and taken into police questioning, where he remained uncooperative with police and evaded police questioning. He was told he was there because of the Paul Onions incident, but he would also be questioned about the backpacker killings. He pretty much said he had no idea what police were talking about. And of course, Milat was described during these interviews as someone obsessed with being in control of the situation, despite the mounds of evidence that were found in his home. He claimed he had no idea where any of this stuff came from. He would say, "I don't know, never seen it, doesn't belong to me." He really just gave police the impression that he believed he would be going home in a few days. And for the first few days after the arrest, it appeared that Ivan was really enjoying the attention that being arrested had brought him. And of course, he believed he had complete control over this attention. A week later, on May the 30th, Ivan Milat was charged with killing all 7 of the Belanglo State Forest victims. Milat chose to have the same lawyer he'd used in his 1971 trial where he'd abducted 2 young girls, John Marsden. However, when Marsden advised Milat to plead guilty, Milat swiftly fired his one-time lawyer. It seemed Paul Onions had been the only victim of Milat to escape, which was not only lucky for Onions, but lucky for the whole investigation. The trial, which was a trial by jury, did not start until June of 1996, which was 2 years after Ivan Milat was charged. Not only was he on trial for the 7 backpacker killings, he was on trial for the Paul Onions attack, and he pled not guilty to all charges. Paul Onions was the first prosecution witness, followed by testimonies from the victims' families. This was followed by hundreds of crime scene photos and exhibits, as well as expert witness testimonies. The prosecution's case lasted for 12 weeks. For the defense's case, they called Ivan Milat to the stand, where he denied being the backpacker killer. However, Milat performed really poorly when being cross-examined and left a really bad impression on the jury. The defense's main argument was that someone else in the Milat family was responsible for the backpacker killings, and that Ivan Milat was just the fall guy. Particularly, they were pinning it on Richard and Wally Milat. They argued that despite the evidence presented, the evidence found in his home, the fact that his gun ballistically matched the guns used in the killings, and Paul Onions' testimony, there was no solid proof that Ivan Milat was guilty. The trial lasted 15 weeks, and on July the 27th, 1996, the jury returned to deliver their verdict after 3 days of consideration. Ivan Milat was found guilty of all 7 of the Belanglo State Forest killings, and he actually maintains his innocence to this day. He was also charged with the robbery, false imprisonment, and attack on Paul Onions. Ivan Milat received 6 years for the Paul Onions attack and 7 consecutive life sentences for each of his victims. A standard life sentence in Australia is 20 years, so whatever way you look at it, Ivan Milat is going to be in jail for the rest of his life. 1 year after Ivan Milat was sentenced in 1997, him and an inmate, convicted drug dealer George Savas, plotted to escape the jail basically, and Milat was said to be the mastermind behind this great escape that never happened. They were found out basically, and the 2 were separated. The following day, George Savas was found hanging in his cell after apparently taking his own life. And Milat was transferred to a maximum security prison, the Goulburn prison in New South Wales. Milat, of course, appealed his conviction on the grounds that his legal representation in court was poor, and this somehow breached his right to legal representation. This was not surprisingly dismissed. In 2004, Ivan Milat appealed to the High Court, but this was also denied. Ivan Milat also made several attempts to self-mutilate himself in jail, including in 2001 swallowing razor blades and staples. In 2009, he cut his little finger off with a plastic knife with the intention of sending it to the High Court. Milat was taken to the hospital for this self-inflicted injury, but doctors were not able to reconnect his little finger. And in 2012, Milat went on a hunger strike, actually losing 25 kilos or 55 pounds in order to get himself a PlayStation. At some point, a hacksaw blade was even found in his cell, landing himself in solitary confinement. Also in 2012, Ivan Milat's great-nephew, Matthew Milat, landed himself in jail for 43 years. Apparently, he was really inspired by his great-uncle Ivan's life and decided that he too wanted to be a killer. Matthew Milat took his friend David took him on his 17th birthday to the Belanglo Forest, where he axed him to death. His friend Cohen Klein actually recorded the attack, and Klein was sentenced to 32 years for his involvement in the killing. Both Milat and Klein were only 19 when they were both convicted, which means they were only 17 in 2010 when they committed the crime. To this day, police and many others believe Ivan Milat is responsible for killing way more than 7 people. Many people still do believe that there was more than one killer involved as well, but Ivan himself has said that no one else was involved, even though he still says he's innocent. So, as I said, the Milat family is thick as thieves, so no one's gonna dob anyone else in. It's not known why Ivan Milat committed the crimes he did, but Clive Small, the lead investigator, did theorize that all the killings happened when Ivan was not in a relationship. And by relationship, he means that he had control of someone or something in his life. When he was single, he needed to find someone or something to have control over, and that was his victims. And he's certainly not the only serial killer to only be killing while he's not in a relationship. In 2001, Milat was ordered to give evidence in an inquest into the disappearance of 3 missing female backpackers, but there was not enough evidence to charge him. And again in 2003 and 2005, he was thought to be responsible for the disappearance of 2 nurses and 1 backpacker, but again, no charges were brought against him. In 2005, Milat's former lawyer that had worked with him in 1971, John Marsden, actually made a deathbed confession, and that was that Ivan had not worked alone in killing the British backpackers. His sister Shirley Swar, who died in 2003, had also been involved. In 2005, Ivan Milat's final appeal was denied, meaning he is definitely going to spend the rest of his life in jail. In one final twist in 2015, so pretty recently really, Ivan's brother Boris Milat came forward and confessed that he was aware of one other person that Ivan had shot and killed, and that was taxi driver Neville Knight. And this was back in 1962, so way before the backpacker killings. So Alan Dillon was the man that actually went to jail for Knight's death, but it turned out that Dillon had actually been covering for his own brother, who it turned out did not kill Knight. I don't know if you're following this is a bit confusing, but basically Boris Milat and Alan Dillon did a polygraph test, and it turned out they were both telling the truth. So Boris was telling the truth about Ivan committing the crime, and it turned out that Alan Dillon had been telling the truth, that he did not commit the crime. But of course, a polygraph test is not admissible in court, so this really didn't result in anything happening. And it's really not out of the realms of possibility to believe that Ivan Milat started killing from a young age. So Ivan Milat is still alive in jail today and is 74 years old. There's also a memorial park in the Belanglo State Forest with all the victims' names written on it, which you can go visit if you're game enough to go into Belanglo. And that pretty much sums up the backpacker killer case. I would love to know your thoughts on this case. This was a long one. I'm exhausted. I'm gonna go. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you soon.